In the past 7 months, I've dropped 4 hours off my 50K PR time. I'm currently training for 100K in about 6 weeks, an overnight 50 miler in about 4 months, and I'm finishing off my 2025 race season with a 100 miler in October. In this video, we're gonna talk about the 6 things that I messed up and would do differently if I could start over again as an ultra runner. So if you do nothing else on this list, this first thing is probably the most important, and that's just give yourself enough time to build into the distance. If you're a completely new runner like I was when I started running ultras, skip the whole 5K, 10K, half marathon, gradual step up type deal. I just jumped straight into ultras. If you're gonna do that, start with a 50K. If you're a little bit more experienced, maybe you have some half marathons or some marathons under your belt, it's totally fine to jump up to the 50-mile distance if that's just more enticing to you. I know for some people, maybe going from 26.2 miles into a 50K, which is just over 31 miles, maybe that jump doesn't seem challenging enough to you and you want something that's bigger and feels a little bit more unattainable and that you're really gonna have to work for it. And I think that's totally fine. But either way, give yourself time to build up to that new volume. So back to all my new runners though, I went from not running at all in over 2 years to my first mile. 12 weeks later, I'm on the start line of my first race. And guess who got injured in that build? Me, obviously. And trust me, I say this from a place of experience. Don't do that. If you listen to one thing, just don't do that. I can't emphasize this enough. Don't do it. You're gonna get hurt. I got hurt. It was terrible. If you had told me, hey, in 12 weeks, do you want to run an ultra race at any other point in my life, I would have been like, no, that's dumb. I'm going to hurt myself. I don't know why I decided to completely ignore that, but here we are. The only reason I did that is because life circumstances and I felt the need to completely just change the direction my life was going. And if you need to do that for yourself, then that's totally fine, but don't expect crazy great results is all I'm gonna say. Unless the result that you're looking for is literally just to finish your first ultra race, which for me at the time it was. So for all of my new runners that wanna just jump straight into ultras and you don't really wanna go the route of doing a road half or a road marathon or anything like that, what I recommend is probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 weeks before your first race. And that's if you're starting from complete zero. So again, if you do nothing else on this list, if you just listen to that and give yourself time to build up the volume, you'll be perfectly fine. So the second thing that I would change if I could go back and do it all over again, and I know that this one's gonna ruffle some feathers. I know this one goes against the grain a little bit on what's popular on social media and what a lot of people like to talk about, but I would not do heart rate training. Instead, I would do RPE training. If you don't know what RPE training is, it is rate of perceived exertion. The scale of rate of perceived exertion goes from 1 being almost walking, really just slow recovery type pace, all the way up to 10, which is an all-out sprint in which, you can only hold an all-out sprint for about 30 seconds or less. And there is ranges between there, 2 to 3 would be most similar to zone 2 heart rate training. And then you get into steady state and interval and VO2 max, kind of different training ranges within there. In the future, I'd like to make a much more in-depth video about RPE training. For now, I will just leave it at that. And the whole reason that I would recommend doing RPE training over heart rate is because there's a lot of undiscussed cons to heart rate training when you're first starting out. First and foremost, there's a lot of different things that affect your heart rate. I'll just use my own data as an example, but when I started running, it was the middle of the summer. For me, I needed to stay under I think it was something like 135 or 140 beats per minute. Last summer was a super hot summer all over the US. There was crazy heat waves everywhere, and you know what happens when you go from air-conditioned 70-degree house and you go outside and it's 105 degrees? Even when you're standing in the shade, your heart rate shoots up. So how do you expect to have a new training stimulus of running when you're coming from a place of not running that much, or you're building more volume for all of my more experienced runners? And how do you keep your heart rate low in a situation like that? Really, you kind of can't, unless you're going absurdly slow. To put that into context, I could comfortably run at 2 to 3 RPE, which is, my easy pace. And I could do that in 11 and a half minutes when I started. But trying to stay under my zone 2 heart rate, I actually couldn't go faster than 12:30 pace. I was selling myself so short on the progress I could have been making because I was just staring at my watch, wondering why my heart rate was still just going up and up and up, no matter how slow I was going. And it's not just heat, it's stress, it's sleep or lack thereof, it's caffeine intake. There's so many other things that can happen that are going to affect your heart rate. These watches that show you your wrist-based heart rate are relatively expensive. Not only that, there's a bunch of studies that show they have an error rate often somewhere between like 5 and 15%, especially as you get into the higher heart rate zones. A lot of people, even if they use heart rate data now, they use a Coros armband, or maybe they use like a Garmin chest strap. Not only do you need a watch to measure all your running stuff, but you also have to buy another piece of gear that's like $80 to $100. You could just go off of how good you feel, which is, in my opinion, not only the better way to train, and it's not just my opinion. If you look at ultra running certifications like the USCA cert, which is run by Jason Koop, who is like way more experienced than I will probably ever be in the sport of ultra running, they teach RPE training for a reason. And it's because heart rate is just a little bit unreliable. I'm not saying heart rate training has no place in the sport. Obviously it does. But one of the big things that happens as you become a more experienced runner is your heart rate zones are going to change. Your resting heart rate is probably going to drop. Your zone 2 range will probably adjust. And all of that is a good thing. You have better cardiac health. Even if you figure out your heart rate zones in the first month of your training, chances are 6 to 8 months down the line, all that information might be different anyways. And there's also things like cardiac drift, which we don't have to get into all that, but I just want to say all that to illustrate the fact that when you're starting out, RPE training, it's just the better route to go. So I would love to do a deep dive on all of that stuff in a different video. If you guys are interested in that, just let me know. Even if you don't, I'm probably gonna do it anyways because it's just a topic I'm really interested in. So enough of that. Thing number 3 that I would change is I would drop the mileage goals per week, and I would move just to time on feet as my measurement of volume progress. Here I'm gonna be talking specifically to my beginner runners. So I think the whole time on feet versus mileage argument is very similar to the heart rate training versus RPE training. Overall, for most people, time on feet is just a better way to slowly and consistently build volume than specific mileage is. I think it just fits into your schedule way easier than a specific mileage does. You may not really know your paces super well, and all of that is going to be changing based on the terrain you're running on. Like, do you live in San Francisco where it's hilly? Do you live in Florida where it's completely flat? How crazy hot or cold is it outside? All of those things are a little bit easier to bundle together in just time on feet, which at the end of the day, it's going to correlate to an ultra race a little bit better anyways. If you're going off mileage and say you have, we'll just use some round numbers here to make it easy, but you have 4 runs and all of them you want to do 5 miles, so you get 20 miles within the week. When you're just starting out, if you're anything like I was, those runs are going to be pretty slow. 5-mile run is probably going to take you an hour or more than an hour. You just may not know where to fit that in your schedule as easily. Whereas if you just say, okay, 4 times this week, I will run for an hour and I'm going to keep it at that 2 to 3 RPE range and just nice and slow, build up the strength in my legs, slowly build that durability. It's much easier to fit that into your schedule because, you know, if you got to work at 8, you wake up at 6, you run from 6:30 to 7:30, you have time to shower and go to work. Much more easy to fit that in, or fit that in during your lunch, or if you have responsibilities like I do, like you have a child, then, you know, it's just easier to fit these things into your schedule. And as you get faster, instead of holding yourself back and saying, I'm just running 5 miles today, where for me before, if I was gonna run 5 miles, that would probably take me, 12 miles an hour. Yeah, I was running that in an hour. Now, my easy pace is somewhere around like 8:30-ish per mile. If I'm gonna run for an hour, I'm actually getting way more out of that workout because I'm running more than 5 miles. When you look too much at just the mileage numbers, sometimes you can stretch yourself a little bit too far, but then as you get more and more durable and more experienced, I really think you're just holding yourself back. And not only that, when we're talking about ultra distances specifically, chances are you're gonna walk in your race if there's any sort of, major elevation or anything like that. And I don't mean your 50K has to have 15,000 feet of elevation gain. I just mean that if you come up to a hill that is a 35% grade, even if it's only for 200 feet, you're probably not running up that. So I think when you start to change your mindset, less of mileage and more of, I will just be on my feet today for an hour, or when I do my long run, I'm gonna be on my feet for 2.5 hours. It leaves room for you to be able to walk when you need to make sure you're staying in that easy range, because it's all about slowly and consistently building up this volume, building up this durability. And when you do that for a long period of time, that's how you're gonna get faster. Which, all of that stuff to say, number 4, build your volume consistently and slowly. And maybe slowly isn't the best word, manageably. And the reason for this is because you don't want to get injured. Picture, if you will, a slightly younger Christian who was overzealous about wanting to run an ultra race. Trying to find an ultra race that I can compete in next year. You know, he got really consistent. He was changing his diet a little bit, trying to be a little bit healthier, lifting weights a little bit more here and there with like run specific exercises. And you feel like you're taking all these steps forward, you know, 5 steps forward, 6 steps forward, and then you get injured and you can't run at all for like a month. How does it feel when you take 3 or 4 steps back? It feels terrible because you feel like you've lost all of your progress. And that's why those first 3 recommendations I gave you all kind of funnel into this 4th one of manageably and consistently building your volume. I could sit here and talk about consistent, slow volume building all day long, but I think I've kind of just beaten this horse enough, so we're just gonna move on. This one is a little bit more tactical, a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of something you're gonna really need to know during your first race, especially with all of the social media content around ultra running starting to get into like this high carb fueling world. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I actually do that myself. But number 5 is nail down your hydration before you worry so much about your nutrition. So let me explain. A lot of people in the sport, like the top 10 people at Western States last year, David Roche, who set the Leadville course record last year, a lot of people that were running at Black Canyon's 100K this past February. Oh my God, that was last month. Feels like so long ago. So when you look at people at the top end of the sport that are having this nutrition discussion out in the open on social media or wherever, all of them are talking about high carb fueling, 80 or 90 plus grams of carbs per hour. And I kind of got sucked into all of that. I'd always kind of just heard this old adage that ultra running isn't really a race so much as it is an eating competition where you're doing some running and walking in between. While I still think that is mostly true, especially as I'm getting into these longer distance races, one thing that I didn't realize at the time is that you need water more than you need food, which sounds very simple to say out loud, but in a race context, I just never put 2 and 2 together. If you think about it, you can go like 3 weeks or longer without food if you need to, but you can only really go like 3 days without water. So I think it's super important to understand your hydration needs as early as possible. And there's a lot of super easy ways to do that. One way to do it is a sweat test. And if you're not familiar with what a sweat test is, it's pretty simple. All you do is you weigh yourself before you run, just weigh yourself naked, that way you know your exact weight. And then you run for an hour, and then you weigh yourself again naked after the run. And you can take that loss in weight, and there's a bunch of conversion calculators online. Maybe I'll just link to a really simple one below. Then you can calculate for that temperature and that humidity outside at that level of effort of running, how much water you're going to lose. And then you aim to replace about 70 to 90% of that water during your running. And I'm not saying that nutrition isn't important. Obviously, it's really important if you want to run far and you want to run fast and you don't want to bonk while you're doing it. But you really, really need to dial in your hydration. If you want some like actual real metrics on how this affected my running. So when I ran my first ultra race, it was a 12-hour fixed time event. And my biggest goal was, at some point in that event, I want to make sure I get to my first ultra distance. I want to get to 50K. I ended up doing that in 9 hours and 33 minutes. Now, fast forward through a couple months of coaching and much more consistent, dedicated training, and I went and ran a training camp weekend with my coach out in Arizona, and we did a 50K. I ended up doing that 50K in 7 hours and 33 minutes. And while that was a nice PR to have, it was not nearly the time that I was shooting for. Why was that? Because like 17 miles into the run, I ran out of water in the middle of the desert. How do you think that affected my paces? I had been keeping carbs down just fine, a little bit of protein here and there to like help delay some of the muscle breakdown that comes from running long distances, but I ran out of water and everything just stopped dead. It was almost to the point that I was gonna have to get bailed out. My coach was gonna have to run to the end, grab his car and come back and pick me up, where I'm just withering away on the desert floor. So fortunately that didn't happen. We ran into someone who was camping and he had plenty of extra water, and then we managed to cruise through the rest of the run. What did it look like when I actually had water and I actually took in water and fuel properly just a month later? I was able to go from a 7:30 50K time down to a 5:33. And that's just over the course of a month. So it's not like there was a bunch of extra training in there. I mostly just contribute all of that progress in terms of my PR time from being properly hydrated. And obviously, yes, I had some different training stimulus in there and stuff like that, and we won't get into the nitty-gritty of that, but really the biggest thing was having enough water. So the last thing that I would change if I could go back and do it all over again, you may be able to guess just on my offhanded mentioning of it a couple of times already, but get a coach if you can afford it. I actually had someone offer to coach me very early on in my running before I even had my first race, but I really wanted to see what I was capable of on my own. I think that was totally fine. I do think I could have had a much better first performance had I had someone else's knowledge that was already much more experienced than me in the sport. Granted, it was very nice to almost cut my 50K time in half in just 7 months from going from uncoached to coached by a very experienced person. Really what you're doing when you get a coach is you're buying someone else's knowledge. Having this person who has like 7 more years of experience than I have poke holes in all of the different plans that I've had. And it's great because it's helping me accelerate in the sport faster. And I don't mean like just literally running faster. I mean, my progress has been like this curve that's getting exponentially higher because I have someone else's knowledge. And if you can't afford a coach, that's totally fine. What I did was I just found as many free resources as I could. I hope to be one of those free resources for people one day when I build up enough videos around training philosophy and that kind of stuff. But right now, there's a lot of great people out there that already have that if you need it. My coach, for one, the Everyday Ultra podcast, before I ever reached out to my coach and started working with him, I listened to almost every single podcast he had from the past 4 years just to consume as much free knowledge as I could. The other podcast that I really like that's just so much free information on training philosophy and nutrition and hydration and recovery and all of these other things in ultra running is Some Work All Play, which is by David Roche and Megan Roche. And like I said earlier, David, Leadville course record holder. I mean, why would you not want free information from a dude who is at the top of his game? There is free options out there. And if you're here watching this video, then chances are you've realized that you don't need to go alone. This whole journey, the whole sport of ultra running, I think a big part of it is about community. It's about being around other people who have this shared drive to go faster and go further and see what they're really capable of and challenge themselves to do hard things. So the obvious nice things that you get with a coach are someone who's gonna handle all the scheduling of your training, who's gonna help you safely and consistently build your volume, who's gonna hopefully give you more resources if you're super interested to learn about different training philosophies or strength training specific to runners, hydration, nutrition, all those kinds of things. But I think another great thing about a coach that people don't really talk about as much is if you're really new to this community, new to ultra running or even sub-ultra running, you have this person who can see further down the path than you can. So in those moments where maybe you're feeling like you're just not good enough, or maybe you're feeling like you're not going to be able to reach your goals, you have this person who has been in your shoes already. They know what the road looks like, and they can be the one that believes in you even when you don't. And I think that's a really important thing to have in running, because there is these little moments when you don't really feel like you're making progress, or maybe you do have like a minor injury and you're just wondering if it's all worth it. And I can promise you, if you follow through with your plan and you try to accomplish something that you aren't really sure about right now, but months down the road, when you build this volume and build this consistently, you can prove to yourself that you really can do it. In that gap in between, I think having a coach is awesome, because when you don't believe in yourself as much as you should, you have someone that does, because they've been down this road before and they know where it leads and they know that it's worth the journey. So that's it for today. Rant over on all of the things that I messed up. I have messed up and would go back and change. But until next time, I'll see you around. Peace.